welcome. I am so delighted. Good evening, everybody. I am so delighted to welcome you to this very special event, and it is my honor to introduce not only an extraordinary individual of this world, but a cherished friend, Carole Clements, whose impact on my life and many others has been just profound. I first met Carole in 2002 during my junior year at Naropa University. And from the moment I crossed paths with Carole, they were a force of good in my life. Their teaching opened my mind to the possibility that big, out-of-the-box thinking not only belongs in this world, but is essential to nurture and explore. Fast forward 20 years, and I had the absolute pleasure of reconnecting with Carole and supporting them as they wrote Sex Positivity and White-Sex Supremacy. Tonight, as we gather here at the end of Pride Month, we have the privilege of joining Carole for a spacious, queer, meandering, a conversation that will leave room for questions and inquiry around this thought-provoking gem of a book. Sex Positivity and White-Sex Supremacy is part of a larger series from Routledge Books, including notable works such as Internalized Homonegativity Among Same-Gender Loving Black Men, An Exploration of Truths by P. Ryan Grant, Black Women, Intersectionality and Workplace Bullying, Intersecting Distress by Leah P. Hollis, Sexual Health and Black College Students, Exploring the Sexual Milieu of HBCUs by Naomi M. Hall, The Colonization of Black Sexualities, A Clinical Guide to Relearning and Healing by Anne Morrow, and Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Flat Blackness, and Black Male Death, The Black Masculinist Turn by T. Hassan Johnson. Initially, as James Wadley began to review Carole's work, there was some questioning that he had about a white woman's voice within this larger group of works. However, it became clear that sex positivity and white sex supremacy is a critical and necessary addition to these conversations, as he mentions in the introduction. Carole is a professor of psychology at Naropa University, where they teach undergraduate and graduate courses, including dynamics of intimate relationships, social psychology, erotic intelligence, sexual narratives, human sexuality, and social and multicultural foundations. They are all a present-centered LGBTQIA+ inclusive psychotherapist specializing in gender, sexuality, and intimate relationships for both monogamous and consensually non-monogamous individuals, partnerships, and relationship constellations. Carole presents nationally and internationally on topics such as erotic justice, erotic resilience, developmental sexual complexity, the impact of white supremacy on discursive sexuality, and queering sexuality research. They are also a PhD candidate in human sexuality with a clinical concentration at the California Institute of Integral Studies, with plans to defend their dissertation titled Toward a Queer Model of Sexual Complexity for Therapists, Interrogating White Sex Supremacy Through a Lens of Adult Development in 2025. Sex Positivity and White Sex Supremacy, Ending Complicity and Black Body Erasure is Carole's first book, and they are currently writing their literary memoir titled Lessons from a Flying Toilet, Death, Magic, and Accepting What Is. Carole identifies as queer with a feminine aesthetic. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Carole as we delve into the rich and essential discussions their work inspires. And as we go, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A tab for the question and answer portion of this evening. Welcome.
Thank you, Licia. I guess I just want to start by saying I appreciate coming full circle 20 years later to be colleagues and friends, and it means a lot. And I think I'll start just by acknowledging while I will welcome everyone. And I think I want to start by acknowledging that my role as a professor at Naropa is one of my most cherished roles because I remain a learner. And this book was a testament to the challenge of learning. It was a journey that was challenging and fraught in all kinds of ways. At times, a journey I wanted to stop. And if you've read the book, you understand that what happened while I was in the process of writing the book was I erased more than half of the book. And I seem to have erased the book. So my work of about a year, 6 months to a year of steadfast, diligent work vanished, it erased, or I erased it. And I paid quite a bit of money at the time for a forensic technology specialist to try to retrieve the work that I lost. And he told me at the time that I did everything possibly wrong, like everything that I could do to make it almost impossible to retrieve, I did. And I share that because the book, the process of writing this book is as important, I think, or it's not separate from the work itself. And I think that's apparent, again, if you've read the book, we have to engage in failure when we are working in the arena of sexuality and race, especially if we are white sexuality professionals. Because identifying as white, being white in this culture will cause me certainly and you to get it wrong a lot. And there's a level of comfort that is useful in being uncomfortable, or a willingness certainly to be uncomfortable and fail, which I did quite well in this process. So I have a PowerPoint slide that I think I may bring up. But where I want to start actually is I just want to read for those of you, again, who may have read the book and those of you who may not. I wanted to actually read from the hard book is in the preface, and it is about when I turned white. Right. So it was the real recognition for the first time in my life that I was in fact white. And for me, it happened when I was about 19 years old. So that's many, many moons ago, but it remains poignant because it also intersected with sexuality for me, with rape, actually, for me. So I want to read this portion, and I need to put on my other glasses in order to do that, just by way of beginning. I turned white in the 1980s, in the aftermath of being sexually assaulted in my college dorm room by a white cisgender male student. This singular event tilted my world on its axis, turning it and me upside down. I was catapulted out of the familiarity and perceived safety of my idyllic white world to slum it, as my father would say, with first-generation Black and brown college friends from the South Bronx, Harlem, Jamaica, Queens, Wilmington, Delaware, and Alexandria, Virginia, all of whom knew, before I could grok it myself, the intensity of rage I felt toward the white man. Like other socialized white women, I had been duped into believing that I was fragile and that it was the white man's duty to protect me, misshaping my sexuality. I was named Carole, but raised as Karen, a pejorative term to describe a demanding and entitled white woman, replete with a white supremacist sexual narrative and consciousness that highlighted my racialized sexual superiority via white beauty standards, blue-green eyes and strawberry blonde hair, and white feminine sexual purity and fragility. Rather than question this white supremacist sexual narrative, I believed it to be true. My first conscious memory of it was when I was 9 years old and asked my parents if I could visit my new crush, who played the piano and lived on Steuben Street in Utica, New York. Their answer was a quick and unequivocal no, a rarity for them, because Steuben, they explained, was on the other, aka bad, Black side of town. As traumatic as my rape had been, witnessed by Khadija Jean, my Saudi Arabian roommate, whose disgust seared into me from atop her bunk across the room as my date penetrated me, despite my repeated, albeit drunken pleas not to, causing me to dissociate from my body and float upward toward the ceiling. Nothing prepared me for the betrayal I felt by white culture, consisting of my white family and friends who could neither understand nor handle my rage. In the face of it, they grew defensive. Initially, I did what I was trained to do as a white woman. I collapsed. Until, that is, I was buoyed by newfound friendships with people of color. I think I want to stop there. I wanted to share that because when I was getting ready to write this book in the very beginning and had sent in my early drafts to the editor, James Wadley, James wanted to understand where this topic was for me personally, where it lived in me and why it lived in me so strongly. And I didn't want to write what I just read to you. It felt vulnerable. It felt exposing, and it wasn't something I wanted to share and put out there. And I realized if I was going to write the book, I needed to acknowledge my very personal, very vulnerable journey with this topic. And I share that because I think if we're going to engage, especially this book, I should say, is written for white sexuality professionals so that we can be part of the movement of change, to affect change, especially with regarding Black body erasure. And it's important, I believe, to find a very personal story that's made a difference in your life that you can connect to why you would want to engage in this work. I believe we all have one. Sometimes we've got to search for it. Sometimes, like for me, it was right there. I knew it all the time, but it wasn't something I wanted to share. Certainly, it wasn't something I wanted to share publicly. And yet, that's the work. It's what the work required of me. And so it became part of the book. And as I was preparing for this talk, I went back and read it, and it still startles me, even though it's a story I lived and it lives in me. So I wanted to begin there to invite each of you to consider, what's your story? What's your story? It doesn't have to be traumatic per se, but my guess is it would have an edge to it. And one of the ways that I actually introduce queering, so as verb more than noun in the book, is to consider the notion of queering being an edge state. And what I mean by that, it's being in a place that is uncomfortable, that is uncertain, that is groundless, unknown, and beyond our control. Because I think that's fundamentally, it's the foundation that is required of us to do this work. So I think what I want to do now, I think I have the time. I think I do. I want to show some slides. I'm going to do some screen share now. I probably won't get through all of them, but I wanted to share some because I was trying to consider for me, what are some of the highlights of this book that would be useful? And one of the things I'm actually thinking of right now was a course that I taught this spring, Social and Multicultural Foundations in the Buddhist and Contemplative Psychology program. I always say that wrong. CPBP, Contemplative Psychology and Buddhist Psychology graduate program. It's the program that I graduated from at Naropa, one of my graduate programs. The other was writing and poetics. And in teaching that class, it was the first time I had taught in that program, having graduated from it back in the 90s. I was challenged. It was a delightful ride, and I was challenged to acknowledge my love of concepts and the usefulness of concepts for engaging in this work. And one of the students so bravely questioned the use of concepts because we can indeed hide behind them. And I'm looking for the right word, my commitment, I think is the word I'll use in this moment, my commitment to critical and conceptual knowing is not to hide behind, but to make it useful in affecting change. And so I think that what I hope this book has done, if nothing else, introduce some concepts that you may be unfamiliar with, to give us new language to walk around and to employ when we're looking at sexuality and race, and particularly the way in which white supremacy has shaped sexuality. So I wanted to say that before I show the PowerPoint, and I'm probably going to meander around the PowerPoint a bit, but to introduce some of the key concepts in the book, and by no means all of them, but some that I think might be useful. We'll see. And you may have other questions, and I'm really looking forward to getting to those. Share my screen here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So, sex positivity and white sex supremacy, ending complicity with Black Body Erasure. What I wanted to introduce just as a foundation for all of us is this idea of white sex supremacy, and that we understand it both as a historical fact and a critical concept. As a historical fact, white sex supremacy means that sexual discourse has been shaped by white supremacy, given that the pseudoscience of race and the science of sex arose in the same historical moment, which was the mid to late 1800s. Eugenics, which is using sexual reproduction to increase the likelihood of valued heritable characteristics, namely whiteness, formed the basis of marriage and family therapy. That's a fact. Sexual neurasthenia, it's a concept I came across in my research for my dissertation, actually, and I hadn't heard of it before, and it was a very prevalent diagnosis in the 1800s among upper class men and women, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, among upper class men and women, white men and women, who felt the weight of civilization's progress on their shoulders because they felt responsible for the perpetuation of civilization. And here we're actually interchanging civilization for whiteness. And also understanding white sex supremacy as a critical concept. The reason why this is necessary is it problematizes the cursory adoption of sex-positive rhetoric among sexuality professionals. It's very easy for sexuality professionals, if you are one, you may experience this, to identify as sex positive without understanding or knowing what that means other than not sex negative, right? So there's a way in which it sounds like a good thing because it's positive. And so I'll say I'm sex positive without interrogating what sex positivity is, what it claims to do, and does it actually follow through with those claims. As a critical concept, white sex supremacy steers sex-positive discourse, again, that claims to value intersectionality and inclusion, even as the rhetoric or the discourse remains race-evasive, often in sex positivity. So this notion of white sex supremacy as a critical concept helps steer us away from disconscious racism. I think I have my next slide. I'm going to go into just what that means. And it helps white sexuality professionals practice anti-racist sexuality education, counseling, and therapy. When we can be aware, whether we're working with clients or with students, to hold the way in which white supremacy and the discourse of white supremacy shapes our understanding of sexuality and how we do sexuality, how we have sex, how we engage in sex, what is normal sex, what is not normal sex. So I find it, I wanted to just establish this as a basis, especially for those who may not have read the book yet. So white sex supremacy is historical fact and critical concept. And disconscious racism, if it's a term you haven't heard, it simply means the unexamined adoption of hegemonic norms and privileges. And so hegemonic is the ruling class, right? Norms and privileges amid microaggressions embedded in systems and practices that perpetuate white supremacy and race-based inequities. It manifests as race-evasive discourse rather than blatant racism. And that's actually important because we may often, as white people, identify or have the value of being anti-racist and yet engage in disconscious racism because we haven't developed the practices that help us really interrogate critically what's going on in the discourse, how we're talking about sexuality here in particular. And a key feature, again, is lack of criticality. And so in addition to the necessity of critically examining racism or what's occurring, is the willingness to broach the topic of whiteness or white supremacy or race while in discussions of sexuality. So that feels quite important. I wanted to just acknowledge that here in the United States, whiteness serves as a homing device. I write about this in the book, that the United States is home to over 300 million people of varying ethnicities and races, yet whiteness is its orientation, its homing device. And importantly here, homing device in this context is how we learn what home means. So that it is how we are socialized into coming to understand what matters. It is how we belong, or even if we belong. Race, then, is the social construction that effectually stabilizes or destabilizes home. And this stabilization, destabilization process is implemented according to the racial fixation of bodies, even though race is an idea and not a fact. So I think that what else I want to introduce is this notion that I introduced in the book is the concept of space time. So thinking about anti-racism and persons in space, place, and time. So there's a term that is called synchronous non-synchronicity that was introduced by Ernst Bloch in the 1930s, and it's a conceptual framework explaining how same and different histories converge throughout history and in the current moment. And here's a quote that I think is important for us to have again as a foundation, is not all people exist in the same now. Again, not all people exist in the same now. They do so only externally by virtue of the fact that they may all be seen today, but that does not mean that they are living at the same time with others. Rather, they carry earlier things with them, things which are intricately involved. One has one's times according to where one stands, corporeally, meaning physically, above all in terms of classes and race. And so I argue in the book that I would actually change the term from classes to race. Or I'm thinking of Isabella Wilkerson in caste, we might actually say in terms of caste, which also here in the United States has so much to do with race. So time, so again, keeping in mind this notion of space-time, space, place, and time. So starting with time, time is defined as an indefinite, progressive, and sequential process of existence and events in the past, present, and future, regarded as a whole. More importantly, though, time is an organizing framework for daily life, the course of a lifetime, and conceptualizations of past, meaning history, present nowness, and future myth. I'm not going to say something now about the 50-minute hour. Western or white conceptualization of time is conceived to be fixed and static rather than flowing and dynamic. We often consider time to be linear and predictable rather than circuitous or unpredictable. Time is viewed as a commodity. The sayings, time is money, don't waste my time, or emphasis on achievement, emphasis on youth, that we want to be young, not old, right? So time, especially in Western white culture, is very future oriented. Forget about the past. There's a level of often discomfort and boredom with the present. We're going to get to why this matters for this book. So I'm just introducing, again, space. Space is defined as a continuous area or expanse, which is free, available, or unoccupied. Space is multidimensionality. Humans may experience space as liminality, betweenness, energy, empty but pregnant with possibility. Place. Here's a picture of our kind of downtown Arapahoe campus where Licia and I met in Lincoln's studio many moons ago. Place is defined as a particular area and space, an occupied or unoccupied location with exact coordinates, a region, population center, or location. Examples include a building, part of a building, or a room. So this notion of space-time, space plus place plus time, includes three dimensions of space: height, width, and depth, plus place, exact locations, plus time, an organizing principle or a meaning-making structure for past, present, and future. So we might ask, how might space-time be useful for discussions of white supremacy and race? I posed this question to students in the spring, and so here I wanted to reference simply their names because they really engaged the question, and it was, I think it's quite telling and useful. That space-time exposes different parameters of belonging. Space-time helps expand and clarify the concept of time beyond machinic assemblage and space-time illuminates the dimensional pervasiveness of white supremacy and its effects on embodiment. So another concept that I speak about in the book that encompasses or relates to space-time is this notion of present absence and absent presence. So the present absence of whiteness and the absent presence of ghosts is how I distinguish them in the book. And the present absence of whiteness means present absence accentuates omnipotent invisibility, meaning white supremacy is omnipresent but invisible. It remains invisible through race-evasive discourses. It dehumanizes. It establishes and maintains disconscious racism. So I write somewhere in my book, I believe, that when I was co-presenting at an ASEC conference, what I acknowledged was that white supremacy is as present as the smell of cat piss in a rug or in carpet, right? Like no matter how much we clean it, you can't get out the stench of the pee. And so no matter what we do to disinfect or to sanitize, it's there, it's pervasive. And when I think of white supremacy, I think of that smell, that kind of constant, we can't get rid of it, the present absence of whiteness. Even when we don't see it, it's pervasive, lingering, always there. And the absent presence of ghosts. This refers to the absent presence, makes the marginalized visible. These are the voices of Black, Indigenous people of color who humanize themselves through the spirits and expressions of their ancestors. Their ghosts inhabit, haunt white spaces and white people, and the absent presence of ghosts actually force recognition and reparation. So I talk about the way these two concepts, the present absence of whiteness and the absent presence of ghosts, shows up in my home with my partner. And above the kitchen sink is some inherited what I call colonizer kitsch. And it's, I don't know how to kind of describe it. I might have done a better job in my book, but it is a wall hanging, two wall hangings side by side of John and Priscilla, who came over on the Mayflower as pilgrims. And the story of John and Priscilla is that they're the first couple in the New World, which is ludicrous. They were not the first couple in the New World. But with colonization, they were presumed the first couple in the New World. Those were a present given by my godmother to my parents on their wedding day. And they hang deliberately above our kitchen sink. I'm doing that because I'm almost looking at our kitchen sink. And people will ask, they're kind of an oddity on the wall. They stick out a bit, like, what are those and why do you have them there? I have them there because it brings up a conversation around whiteness. On the other side of Priscilla and John, we have Mama and Daddy Neil, which are my partner's great-grandparents. We have a picture of them. And I say that our kitchen table sits between these two shores deliberately. And so I care about aesthetic. It's why I acknowledge more as an aesthetic myself than an identity, because there's a way in which we can evoke conversation through aesthetic. And the book itself talks about going around your home looking for images of whiteness. So looking for the present absence of whiteness, like seeing it, making it visible, and the absent presence of ghosts, right? So Mama and Daddy Neil represent for us and for my partner and that lineage of our family, the absent presence of ghosts. And I want to go next to say where I'm getting this language from, especially the absent presence of ghosts. There is a wonderful article from 2008 by Yvonne Brown called Ghosts in the Canadian Multicultural Machine, a tale of the absent presence of Black people. And I reference this in the book, and Brown refers to the presence of living ghosts, who are peoples dispossessed of territories, clans, families, and cultures, and transformed into labor, slave labor, indentured labor, cheap wage labor, and how they cast their shadow of European colonization that multicultural discourse cannot conceal. One of the reasons I posit that the multicultural project has failed is because too often it acknowledges inclusion, but it doesn't interrogate white supremacy. And one of the challenges, and James Wadley, the series editor, questioned, as did reviewer C, why talk about whiteness in a series that is dedicated to leading conversations about Black sexualities and identities? And what I said to that is that this is not about performing whiteness, it's about interrogating whiteness. So it's about understanding its pervasiveness, being willing to call it out, especially as white people, so that we're neither performing multiculturalism or performing whiteness, but we're really interrogating what is. So I actually am going to stop here. I have, if any of my students, past or present, in more recent years are here, you'll know just how long my PowerPoint is. It goes on and on and on. And I want to be able to engage with all of you. I might pop back here to reference it, but I'd love to kind of bring Alicia back and see if we can start dialoguing. I just wanted to begin with some concepts that I think might be useful, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hi, Alicia.
Hello, Carole. I just love this foundational aspect of the talk that you just gave, because I think it's so important. And one thing that I would love to hear more about and talk more about is going back to the erasure of your manuscript, right?
Yeah.
And there's so many layers to it. Obviously, the erasure aspect, it was gone, it's gone, didn't exist. The time aspect, the spliced time aspect, right? And so as that happened, how do you think that it informed then what came to be the book, right? How did it change, and how did you relate to it in a new way, and what occurred after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. Maybe I should start by saying you acknowledge that the book that I'm currently working on, which is a literary memoir, is titled Lessons from a Flying Toilet. And the reason why it is titled that, it's because the toilet I'm talking about is a toilet on an airplane, where I found myself after pretty significant losses, crying, sobbing, right? So the grief, I would allow the grief to flow when I was between going, after my father had died unexpectedly, for example, and I was taking a plane back home to be with my mother, is one example. And I learned that I had erased all of the chapters and pages that I erased when I was on an airplane, 30,000 square feet in a middle seat. I had sent James the preface and the first three chapters, or the first two chapters, when they were due, which was 2 years ago. So it was 2022, I believe they were due. This has been a very long journey. And I was heading to New York on vacation, but I thought, let me just reread the chapter 3 through 7 to make sure it's like that I've got it. And I let him know that, and I'll send it in the morning. And I took the original, and I cut and thought I saved and whatever. When I opened my computer and opened the file, sitting on the plane to start work, to read and just kind of do some fine tuning, it wasn't there. I was like, I couldn't breathe. And I thought, oh my God, I think I did. I think I did it. And I thought, no. And so I scrambled and looked for all of the kind of files that I could, and I couldn't find the biggest chunk of my work anywhere. And I started panicking, and I wanted to scream, and I wanted to scream out, and I wanted to cry. This was like a grand loss. And I knew in that moment, what I can say is I knew in that moment it was gone. I knew it was gone. And I got off, and friends greeted me. It was midnight. And I was bereft, and they said, oh, no, no, no. I'm sure you've just found, you just misplaced it, or you'll get it back. There's so many ways to do this, long story short. It never came back. It never came back. And I pulled out all the stops. I called everybody I knew. I had a lot of help, and it couldn't be found. And so then your question to me is, what was the impact of that? First of all, James was a dear human. I called sobbing because it was due, and I didn't have it anywhere on my computer to send the rest. I didn't know how it was going to be retrieved. So I had the support of James Wadley, the editor. The editor from Routledge was wonderful. So I had a lot of support. But what was really interesting, and I think I do speak about this in the book, is that as I expressed my upset, and I was visibly, audibly upset, it was many of my white friends and colleagues who said, I get it. Like, I get it. There will be other opportunities. You'll be able to write another book. So there was encouragement to stop, to let go, to just end the project. And my partner, who identifies as a cisgender Black man, said, you will not. I don't know that he said it that way, but he said, you can't. Like, what do you, why would you even consider it? And that was a moment that lingers still, because I realized then that I had the privilege of, first of all, my body as a white person is not erased, right? So it's like they're words on a page. They can be rewritten. Okay, so in the scheme of things, this is a small loss. So put it in perspective, Carole, right? So that was it. And then I thought, and as tired as I am, and I don't want to redo, I don't want to rewrite. That's exactly what's being called. And so for me, that's the heart of the work. Like, we lose things all the time, or just when we think we have it and we're at the pinnacle of something, away it goes. And I think that's a metaphor for this work, because we never have it. It slips through. So that was a long answer to the question, but it was a very, I remember that moment.
Yeah. Well, and I love this idea of the different perspectives and coming to the no, your partner saying, no, you have to keep going, and having, because that brings me to, sort of the next question, which is this idea of rushing and wanting to sort of move through things, right? And so how for, the therapists in the group today, how can we, I'm not a therapist, but how can they how can they monitor that? Because I think as white people, we're just, it's so ingrained in us of like, whoo, move it, move it, move it, move it, right? Like, let's move through it. Okay, we did it. Check off the list. Like that's done. So how is it that we can incorporate, even if we're not therapists, like that slowing down, that
Mhm.
mindfulness, the rushing, and can you
Mhm.
speak more to that?
Yeah, it's great. Um, I think it's why failing is so useful. And that was like a grand fail, right?
Hmm.
And not in the kind of sexy notion, like failing can be, kind of an in thing to do or something. It was like a miserable fail,
Hmm.
right? It was like to my knees, like it was wretched and painful.
Hmm.
And it slowed me way down. And what I thought I was going to be able to do is like just rewrite it, like hurry up and rewrite it. And I think I told James I can get it done in 3 months. There was no way. There was no way. So I had to be willing to labor again in a way I didn't want to at times. Like it
Hmm.
was tiring. And I found moments that sustained me. And I would say that most of them came from the support of my friends of color
Hmm.
um, because they believed I had something to contribute to the conversation. And it was echoes from so long ago when um, I had such rage. This wasn't rage, it was upset. But when I had such rage, it was the way I was held by different communities,
Hmm.
right? Or not held, right? So I would say that the rewrite, I mean, I can't know what it was before because I kind of forgot.
Yeah.
And when I realized this is what it was meant to be,
Yeah.
right? So I had to kind of trust that actually the erasure was part of the process,
Yeah. Yeah.
fundamental to my own work, right? And it gave me another year and a half to
Hmm.
be with this stuff. And so
Yeah.
that alone was deeply valuable, right? Otherwise, I probably would have gone, okay, that's done, put it over there. But it was like, we're not letting you go,
Yeah.
right? Like you're going to stay here and you're going to deal with it
Yeah.
again and again and again. And yeah, I guess that's what I'll
Yeah.
share.
And then that's the work, of course, too, of like dealing with what is
That's
again and
right.
again. We did,
Again and again and again.
again and
Yeah,
again. It's very difficult and
yeah,
necessary.
yeah,
And I think that's what,
yeah, yeah.
um, we were talking earlier, and I
Mhm.
think this is, worth repeating. And also, if anybody has any questions at all, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We can certainly take a look at those as well. But one thing Carole and I were talking about earlier is that this book, you reference it a lot, right? So can you speak to that referential aspect of it, of like you pick it up, you open it, you referencing it like in your work
Oh
or
yeah,
in
and
your
yeah, yeah,
days?
yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
how do you utilize it as a tool in your
Yeah,
days?
yeah. I want to bookmark something because I don't want to forget it. Intimacy. So I'm just going to say
Yeah,
that word and then
got it.
remind me of that in a moment. Um, when I finished this book, I was exhausted. I was
Mhm.
done. I never wanted to read it or see it or anything again. So there was that. This was a years long labor, and I wanted to be complete. And a box arrived unexpectedly. I was told the copyright date would be coming out in 2024, which is the copyright of the book. And I got a box unexpectedly in last August,
Mhm.
um, of the from Routledge. I didn't even know who it was from,
Yeah.
of a handful of books. And I opened it up and I went, ah! And I closed the book and I slid the book under my desk. And I didn't, or the box under my desk. And I did not look at the book. I did not take it out. I did not, nothing. I put it away. And I thought, I'll deal with it in 2024, right?
Yeah.
Because I actually needed space. from the process. It was long. And then the course I referenced earlier, which was I was teaching a social multicultural foundations class in spring. And as I was preparing for the class, I thought, oh, wait a minute, I know what I want to bring in. I know what's going to be important and foundational. And so I thought, oh, okay. So I know it's in that book. And that book was actually the book I wrote. But what I've learned is when you write something, I think you might have even shared this with me, Licia, being a writer yourself, is that when you publish a book, it's no longer yours, right? Yeah. So it's an offering, for better or worse, it's out there and it's going to do its thing. And then you get to relate to it as if it's informing you. And so that's been an extraordinary process, actually. Yeah. And I highlighted, I don't know that it was so helpful, but I highlighted the concept of synchronous non-synchronicity, the present absence and the absent presence of ghosts, because these were helpful for me to re-encounter. Yeah. And what I didn't get to in the slides was the idea of discourse, right? So sexuality is many things. One thing it is, it's a discourse, meaning how we talk about sex, right? And sexuality. So, and it's a big part of the book, and sex positivity. But I wanted to loop back for a moment to intimacy. So that was my bookmark, because what I found was there's something about this book for me that it's an encounter in intimacy. And I think that to do the work of bridging sexuality and race, especially the impact of white supremacy on the shaping of our sexuality, is intimate work. And we don't often name it as such. Like, it's intimate work. It touches us. Like, it touches our bodies and our minds. And I'm doing this because there's a way when I think of intimacy, there's something where we're revealed, right? There's complexity and nuance, and I'm revealed, and I'm in an encounter of sorts. And it's not always pleasurable. It's not always pleasant. It's jagged and difficult and sometimes relieving. It's all kinds of things. But for me, there's something about this book now. My relationship to it is well, I'm having a new relationship with it, and it's an intimate one. Yeah. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that. And again, if anybody has any questions at all, please do put, oh, there's some questions coming in now. I think that before I start going to these questions, the one thing I want to say is I think that intimacy and that relational quality is an automatic slowdown, right? Like, yeah, as soon as we become intimate with something, we can't rush it, right? Or we that space time starts to, or that spaciousness, pregnant pause, like with fertility. So I think that it's such an interesting concept to think about, of like, how can I be intimate with myself, with the world, with this book, with the, and that relational quality. So I think that's just a beautiful thought. So thank you for sharing that. So, so one question that's come in, Carole, it's from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, what are ways that personal sexual trauma and cultural traumatic dynamics around sexuality can show up in other, maybe surprising aspects of our lives and experience?
Can you read that again? I just want to take it.
Yeah. What are ways that personal sexual trauma and cultural traumatic dynamics around sexuality can show up in other, maybe surprising aspects of our lives and experiences?
You have to read it one more time, because there's a couple of there's a couple of components that I want to address. So please read it one more time, please. Yeah,
Okay, no problem. What are ways that personal sexual trauma and cultural traumatic dynamics around sexuality can show up in other, maybe surprising aspects of our lives and experiences?
So personal sexual trauma, cultural
Traumatic dynamics
traumatic dynamics.
around sexuality.
Yeah. And how it can show up in other.
Yes, maybe surprising aspects of lives and experiences.
I wish I could converse with this person because I'm actually curious what they would say.
Yeah.
I think what comes up for me as I'm just reflecting on the question, it's a rich one, and I think it's multi-layered. The word, what's coming up for me is the word collision. And I feel very curious about how, in this moment, how personal sexual trauma collides with cultural traumatic dynamics. And I feel like this sounds like almost such a personal question, which I deeply appreciate. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that end there. But what I want to say is I think there's a collision, and I think that may be why it's so hard to engage this topic, is I think that we have a personal experience, if we have a personal experience of sexual trauma, which I do, okay? And then it collides with cultural trauma, right? And I can say that as a white person, it gets quite confusing. So the collision, instead of clarifying or helping, it makes it more murky and confusing and hard to kind of suss out, right? So one of the things that's coming up for me now, this might be the surprise. I have no idea. I appreciate the question. I have no idea if this was even close to what the participant is thinking. But what just came up for me in this moment is that my whiteness caused me to freeze in the aftermath of sexual trauma. That I believe it wasn't just me, personal Carole, but my being raised white in a white society with who was supposed to be protected in whiteness and then was sexually harmed caused me to collapse. And as I became more aware of kind of the cultural trauma, and especially around race, that's where I began over time to develop my resilience. Because I had privilege in that arena. I had the privilege of whiteness. So I had to figure out how to develop, how to stay in the hard conversations. So interestingly, I think what's surprising to me just in this moment is the way in which that work actually helped heal. And I'm talking personally, helped heal my sexual trauma. Because I developed resilience in this sphere where I had the privilege. And I had less privilege as a socialized female who was sexually assaulted. Right? So I have no idea if that answers it. It's an interesting question, and one I could have you read like 3 more times.
Yeah. But I like that aspect of collision too.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's important.
Yeah.
So this question comes from Sam, and Sam says, as a gay Latino cis man, I have put white men on pedestals my whole life, partly due to my religious upbringing in the Mormon church and to growing up in a white supremacist culture. I'm currently doing inner work on taking the projections I have projected onto white men and seeing the sense of power and attractiveness in myself. I'm curious if you could speak to what kind of work can be done to tending to the pain in oneself due to white sex supremacy, and how one can do the work with their partner if they're in a multiracial relationship.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Would you read it again, please?
Yeah.
Sam,
As
I
a
may know you. I'm thinking it might be a Sam I know, but yes.
As a gay Latino cis man, I have put white men on pedestals my whole life, partly due to my religious upbringing in the Mormon church and to growing up in a white supremacist culture. I'm currently doing inner work on taking the projections I have projected onto white men and seeing the sense of power and attractiveness in myself. I'm curious if you could speak to what kind of work can be done to tending to the pain in oneself due to white sex supremacy, and how one can do the work with their partner if they're in a multiracial relationship.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Sam.
Mhm.
First of all, I'm so glad to hear your own awareness for the way in which you've put white men on a pedestal. I understand why you would do that because you were socialized to do that, and that you're kind of claiming, I was going to say reclaiming, but it might be a new quality of claiming your own beauty and power, which is essential. Um, One of the things, it's interesting, you're reminding me of going to a Quad S conference, the Society for, I always forget what it stands for, 4 S's, the Society, I can't remember, the Sexuality Conference in British Columbia um, a couple of years ago, and running into another researcher there who was very interested in interracial relationships and looking at interracial relationships and um, how the extent to which partners talked about race or didn't talk about race, how that impacted their quality of satisfaction in their relationship. And what was interesting in just preliminary results was that the more partners who are in an interracial relationship, multi-ethnic relationship with each other, the more race is discussed, the more satisfied the partners are in the relationship. So when I share where my kitchen table is located, I can share that my partner and I and my 88-year-old mother now who lives with us have conversations about race daily, daily at that dinner, mostly dinner conversations. My partner and I have them elsewhere, but we have them most nightly. And so to develop a habit, I think is what I want to say, a familiarity, a willingness to have the conversations. My partner just asked me the other day where it came from for me that I could have conversations like this. And it's a long answer that I won't share here, but it isn't a question he asked me before. And I think having the conversations with partners, acknowledging our roles, so our love and our roles, right? And our socially prescribed roles. So not that I have to acknowledge in my relationship that I have the privilege of whiteness. And when we're in an intimate partnership, if we're in an interracial relationship, the white partner has to be willing to acknowledge that privilege and to handle the moments that are really painful.
Mm.
I can think of what happened just in my kind of relationship around when there was a lot of, I mean, George Floyd was in the news, right, during the pandemic, and we were again home more and watching. That's where this all erupted for me, came to be for me. And we were having very intense, rage-filled conversations. And there is a way to have rage-filled conversations when we're not going horizontal at each other. So maybe that's what I would say, Sam, is like what to develop. It's like how we can express rage or hurt when and going vertical, so that I can say, I'm so angry, right? And I'm there, I just said it there, holding myself, feeling my my verticality with it, as opposed to, you know, going this way, which we do if we're using language like you, but even if we're trying to be more skillful, if we're going vertical, it's so different than if we're going horizontal. So that's what I would say in this moment.
Beautiful. Thank you. So the next question we have is from Lindsay. And Lindsay says, I love this background on white supremacy and erasure, and I'd love to hear how this fits in more specifically with sexuality, sex positivity, queering, and Black and non-white sexuality.
Yeah. So would you read it one more time?
I love this background on white supremacy and erasure, and I'd love to hear how this all fits in more specifically with sexuality, sex positivity, queering, and Black and non-white sexuality.
Yeah. So I think what I'm going to do is actually, can I still share my screen? I can share my screen, because what I didn't get to was the meat of what Lindsay's asking, and I think it might be useful to just take us there to get more like, how does this relate to sexuality? And specifically, it starts with discourse and what discourse is. So I think it just might be useful. Do I want to show the slides? I think I do. I think I do, because I think it'll be useful, and it will begin to address Lindsay's question. So let me just see if I can do a share screen, if that works again. Does. Okay. So, and it was queued up as the next one. So that's rather perfect. So one of the things I talk about in the book is sex positivity. What's important, maybe, and I'll introduce it here, is a discourse, right? Meaning it's how we talk or think about sex. Okay, it's a discourse. Sex positivity is a discourse. In here, I want to just introduce, what does discourse mean? It's introduced in the book. And the discourse is a dynamic social practice that constructs the parameters of our social world, shaping our personal identities and social relationships, including our relationship with sexuality. Rather than being natural, gender and sexuality are shaped through social discourse and maintained, often policed, by hegemonic power structures, including therapy. As part of the mental health power structure, therapy is often a technology of social control. And so here I'm gonna fast forward here. Just bear with me for a moment here. Oops. How do I go back? There we go. Okay, so to Lindsay's question, one of the ways this relates is to actually look at sexuality through the lens of discourse. And I identify in the book 5. We could identify more, but I identify 5, and I think it's worthwhile for me to just introduce them quickly here, which is civilization discourse, normality discourse, erotic love and marriage discourse, sexual health and betterment discourse, and sex positivity. And the reason why, again, I'm kind of harping on discourse is often we're not aware that we're talking, like how we're talking about sex. We're not interrogating that. So it's actually important to consider, if we go back to this notion of disconscious racism, that we become disconsciously racist if we're not looking at how are we talking about sex. And there are ways that culture has talked about sex in the cultural milieu through the years, right? Since the inception of sexuality as a field, which again began in the 1800s as the kind of sciences were really becoming robust, right? And so there was a science of race, pseudoscience, not real science, and then the science of sexuality. And those were sciences that were modeling themselves after the natural sciences with categorizations. And so you see that in sexuality, gender, and you see that in race as well, and the science of race. So let me just introduce very quickly these discourses, because they're the ways in which we talk about, and again, it's in the book, civilization discourse. Civilization discourse centers on sexual self-discipline and sexual self-control. And it was the prominent discourse in the 1800s to the 1850s when, again, sexuality as a field of study was coming to be as a science. It is patriarchal, it values chastity and purity, it is nervous and fragile. And during this period of time, neurasthenia was a prominent diagnosis, again, where whites were overwhelmed with their responsibility as inheritors of white civilization. Civilization discourse was, we could say, segregationist. I have it here, and assimilationist, right? So segregationist is kind of blatant racism, like separating races, not even separate and equal, separate and unequal. And assimilationist means it's a way to assimilate, like come into the white culture and assimilate, look like us, be like us, behave like us, be chaste and pure, as an example. Normality discourse replaces civilization discourse in the 1860s and 1940s, through the 1940s. And what's interesting about normality discourse is race becomes evasive. Okay, so this is how we're talking about sexuality, okay? So we move from civilization discourse into normality discourse, which replaces, or it becomes race evasive. So we're not talking about race, but whiteness is omnipresent, okay? And there's a specific focus on careful, disciplined reproductivity, right? And having sex to reproduce becomes paramount, okay? And what happens here is a discourse shifts to normality, focusing on white sexual health, marriage, and babies. And so this is what I say in the book, is like where white sex becomes cemented as a thing that never gets talked about as a thing, as being white, okay? So let me just introduce you to in a moment to Norma and Norman, okay? So Norma and Norman were pretty pivotal characters in the development of sexual discourse. And they were first shown in the first exhibited in 1939 at the New York World's Fair. And then to the wider public in the summer of 1945 at the Cleveland Health Museum. And it's very interesting because their bodies are the statistical averages of a slew of men, white men, and white women. So their proportions are actually, they were made off of statistical averages, which is just kind of fascinating to know and screwed up. And they were called Norma and Norman because they're the normal, right? Like they exemplify white sexual progress and normality. And they exemplify that in their physical, mental, and emotional behavior. manifestation, and their sexuality. They were actually used to teach sexual health, which essentially here means reproduction and the reproductive legacy of modern native white Americans. That makes sense. So I'm just going to go through so that there are these series of discourses that that kind of appear on the scene. And it's a way, sexual discourses where whiteness is present, but it's not acknowledged, right? So we go from normality to erotic love and marriage. And that's where kind of the modern white heterosexuality becomes a way of life, right? And an erotic, sexually fulfilling marriage becomes a cultural necessity to actually keep married white people together, because there's a threat of extinction of the modern white family due to women in the workforce for the first time in greater numbers, right? And as part of kind of this era, it actually crosses both a little bit, but Paul Papineau, who is a famed marriage counselor and eugenicist, was dedicated to the preservation of coupledom and a sound that is code for white, normal, civilized family life, right? So he was supervising the eugenic sterilization programs in California, and he is the famed, it's the foundation of marriage and family counseling in the United States, is based on eugenicist reproduction, right? And so this is important to know, and it's not often what we understand just about when we're talking about sexuality. It's history. I talk in the book about the difference between history and historicity. And so historicity is actually much more than just facts, right? It's actually the narratives, it's the discourse, it's the lived experience of people and what was kind of, we could say, really going on. I want to notice my time. Okay, let me just, and then the fourth discourse is sexual health and betterment. And there's a lot I could say about this, but this is a real focus from the 1980s to the present. And there's a lot of focus on the medicalization of sexuality here, especially by the blue pill, Viagra, the blue pill. And there has been since then a ongoing quest for a pink pill. I could say more about that, and I won't here. But sexual self-help becomes a key feature of sex positivity. And then here I talk about sex positive discourse, which actually begins, I just noticed now, I don't have a date here, but I would say begins in the 1970s, kind of officially when the term is somewhat coined. And there isn't a formal definition of sex positivity. And yet sexuality professionals often adopt sex positivity as a slogan that's important to them. They will say, I'm a sex positive professional, without actually knowing what that means. And what is interesting, what I can see here, that sex negative culture is presumed to be more racist than sex positive culture, even though both lack critical interrogation of whiteness and white supremacy. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And one thing, and Lindsay, thank you for the question, that feels important to acknowledge that as I was writing this book, I purchased every book written on sex positivity. And you will find, if you read those books, that the books and most of the articles on sex positivity almost always, there are a few exceptions, but almost always underscore how important inclusion is and intersectionality is. And yet what's fascinating to me is not one of them, and I mean not one of them, mention white supremacy and the way white supremacy shapes sexuality, our idea of sexuality, how it should be. And there's so much. I mean, you'd have to read the book because there's so much, but it's a glaring omission that it never even tackles this idea of white supremacy and its role in shaping how we talk about sex and how we do sex. So I hope that maybe illuminated some of what, because that was an important question, Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question if you're up for it. Great.
Yeah.
So this is an anonymous question. So for therapists, what would you say we most need to be mindful of so people don't feel erased? I've heard to acknowledge our differences and to ask the client how they feel about working with someone white, straight, etc. Do you agree, or do you have other suggestions?
Yeah. So I would say, so there, that question is actually about broaching, right? So broaching is the term used, that it's a technique, it's a term, but it's a practice used in therapy to where the therapist can broach, in this case, a white therapist can broach the topic of race with, I'm gonna say this, with, let's say, people of color, clients of color. But what I want to say is equally important, and this is the glaring problem for me, is that white therapists often will not broach whiteness with white clients.
Mm.
And I think that's the greatest problem, because it's in the room. If there are just white people in the room, right, in a therapeutic setting, whiteness in the shaping of white sexuality is present, profoundly so. And as white clinicians, if we don't broach race with white clients, we do a grave disservice to clients of color.
Mm.
So that oftentimes, and I understand the way kind of the rhetoric is even around like multiculturalism, that there's this idea that we would broach race or talk about race with people of color, but we wouldn't actually talk about race with clients of color. I'm sorry, white clients. And it's so important because it's shaping, white supremacy is shaping everybody's bodies and everybody's sexuality, right? And that could be like how it's doing that. You can read the book to get some insight into that. But there are many ways that's occurring. And so we have to become much more aware of that impact.
Thank you, Carole.
Yes.
This has just been such an illumination, and this book really is a little gem of a book and one that is so good to reference. So thank you.
Yeah,
Is there
thank you.
anything else you'd like to end with, or any final thoughts?
You know, maybe I'll say, maybe I do want to say one thing. One of the questions, so with the last question, which I appreciated, like what to do in a therapeutic context. And I answered the question with broaching. Broaching, if you are a clinician of color, broaching race is much more challenging to do. And so clinicians of color may choose not to broach race. And I support that. I mean, not that I have to support it, but that makes perfect sense to me. I think the onus, and I want to, maybe I'll say it this way, the developmental learning, the trailing edge for many white clinicians in dealing with sexuality is understanding how their own whiteness, or the socio-cultural white heterosexuality, heteronormativity is more of what I mean. Heteronormativity or even homonormativity is actually playing out.
Mm.
in very intimate ways. And naming that, so it requires some kind of learning and engagement. It's not something that can be done without a commitment to really engaging the work, is what I would say, right? Because otherwise, we'll like what you said earlier, we'll check the box, like I broached it, I said it, we talked about it, but then we'll assume it doesn't have a place in therapy, when I think it's actually at the heartbeat of it. Otherwise, we end up, we risk that therapy becomes a technology of oppression, of maintaining normativities, sexual normativities, rather than a technology of liberation.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll end there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of this. Thank you to all the participants of this evening. It's such a joy to be with you all, and just a lot of gratitude for the work you're doing in the world, Carole.
Thank you, Licia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.